Before, he had been a warning. Now, he was a reminder. That single shot, fired not in rage, not in panic, but in absolute clarity, had recalibrated the streets. Rival crews dissolved or realigned. Men who had tested boundaries quietly withdrew. The code, once frayed, tightened again. Violence didn't disappear, it became controlled, and in Harlem, control meant survival. The man who had fired the shot never spoke about it. He didn't brag, didn't explain. When asked directly, he gave the same answer every time. I did my job. That answer spread just as fast as the story itself, because everyone understood what that job really was. Not killing, preventing chaos. The police tried one last angle, leaning on informants, offering deals, promising protection that rang hollow in a neighborhood that remembered every broken promise. But no one talked. Not because they were afraid, because they were invested. Bumpy Johnson wasn't perfect. No one believed that. But he was predictable, and predictability was safer than the alternatives the city had offered for decades. When children could walk to school without stepping over shattered glass, that mattered more than headlines. When businesses stayed open past sunset, that mattered more than arrests. And when men who brought disorder were removed swiftly and decisively, the community slept easier, even if it never said so out loud. Weeks later, the captain ran into Bumpy one last time. It happened by chance, or something close enough to pass for it, outside a courthouse downtown. No uniforms, no witnesses worth impressing. The captain nodded stiffly. "Looks like you won," he said. Bumpy adjusted his coat. "This was never a competition," he replied. The captain scoffed. "Funny way of showing it." Bumpy met his gaze. "You came into my house looking for fear," he said. "What you found was balance." The captain said nothing, because he had no answer for that. They walked away in opposite directions, and that was the end of it. Back in Harlem, the bodyguard returned to his quiet role, standing near doors, watching corners, saying very little. But people noticed when he entered a room. Conversations lowered, arguments ended early, not because he was violent, but because everyone remembered what happened when boundaries were crossed. The body on the pavement, the silence afterward, the order that followed. That was justice, Harlem style. Not courts, not headlines, consequence. Bumpy Johnson continued to age, continued to operate, continued to hold Harlem together through a mixture of intellect, intimidation, and an unspoken agreement with the community he protected. And that single shot, never officially acknowledged, never recorded in a report, became one of those stories that refused to die. Old men told it in whispers. Young men learned from it without being told. It wasn't about the gun. It was about restraint. Because power, real power, wasn't measured by how often it was used, but by how rarely it needed to be. The bodyguard remained nameless in the papers, but in Harlem, names weren't always what mattered. Actions were, and that action had rewritten the rules. Time moved on, the way it always does in Harlem, forward, but never forgetful. Years passed, and the streets changed their clothes. New storefronts replaced old ones. Jazz gave way to soul, then to sounds that hadn't yet found names. Faces rotated, corners changed hands, but certain rules remained untouched. No reckless bloodshed, no public humiliation of the neighborhood, no mistaking noise for power. Those rules weren't written anywhere. They didn't have to be. They lived in memory. And at the center of that memory sat one moment, one shot, that had drawn a line so clean, so undeniable, that even the city learned to step around it. Bumpy Johnson's name grew heavier with time. Not louder, heavier. The kind of weight that bent conversations and shortened arguments. When disputes threatened to spiral, someone would inevitably say, "You know how this ends." Everyone knew exactly what they meant. That was the legacy. Not fear, clarity. Bumpy became less a man and more a reference point. A reminder that Harlem had its own gravity, its own laws, enforced not by chaos, but by consequence. Outsiders learned to negotiate instead of dictate. Politicians learned to speak carefully. Police learned that presence without understanding only created resistance, and the bodyguard, the man who fired the shot, became something quieter still. He remained where he had always been, just off to the side, just out of frame. Children didn't know his name, but they recognized his walk, his posture, the way adults straightened when he passed. He never needed to explain himself. They sat him in an interrogation room with no clock and bad lighting. Hours passed. Then the captain entered, folder under his arm, confidence rehearsed. "You're done," he said, tossing photos onto the table. Crime scenes, bodies, grainy shots meant to suggest guilt without proving it. Bumpy studied them calmly. "Is that all?" he asked. The captain's smile tightened. "We know your bodyguard fired those shots." Bumpy met his eyes. "Do you?" The captain leaned back. "You give him the order?" Bumpy's voice stayed even. "I give a lot of orders. Feeding families, keeping peace, stopping fools from burning down their own neighborhood." The captain slammed the folder shut. "You think the community's going to save you?" Bumpy leaned forward now, just enough. "No," he said. "I think your lack of evidence will." Silence. The captain stared at him, realizing, too late, that he had brought intimidation to a chess match. Hours later, Bumpy Johnson walked out of the precinct a free man. No charges, no apology, just a quiet humiliation that echoed louder than any gunshot. And standing across the street, waiting exactly where he always did, was the bodyguard. That should have been the end. But men who lose power rarely accept it gracefully. 2 nights later, the captain made his final move. A raid. No warrant worth the paper it was written on. No intention of holding up in court. Just a show of force, breaking doors, flipping tables, terrorizing people who had nothing to do with the game. They hit a building tied loosely to Bumpy's operation, dragged men into the street, shoved women aside, made sure everyone knew who had the guns. That was the mistake. Because Bumpy Johnson didn't respond to humiliation with rage, he responded with inevitability. By morning, word reached every corner of Harlem. Bumpy wanted a meeting. Not with the streets, with the city. It happened in a church basement, neutral ground again, chosen for its symbolism. City officials, police representatives, community leaders, even a reporter or two who knew better than to write the wrong thing. The captain sat stiff-backed, jaw set. Bumpy entered last. No entourage, no theatrics, just presence. He sat across from the captain and folded his hands. "This ends today," Bumpy said. The captain laughed under his breath. "You don't give orders here." Bumpy didn't blink. "No," he agreed. "I give consequences." A murmur rippled through the room. Bumpy turned slightly, addressing everyone. "Every time order breaks down in Harlem, you call it crime. But you never ask why the streets stayed quiet when you weren't looking." He looked back at the captain. "You broke that order, and now you're surprised the community's angry." The captain leaned forward. "You threatening me?" Bumpy shook his head. "No," he said. "I'm explaining economics." He gestured around the room. "When Harlem is stable, businesses run. When businesses run, taxes get paid. When taxes get paid, politicians sleep better." He locked eyes with the captain. "You want war, you'll get headlines, investigations, federal eyes where you don't want them." The room went still. The captain swallowed. Bumpy leaned back. "Or," he continued, "you let us handle our own, quietly, like we always have, and Harlem stays calm." A long pause. Then one of the city officials cleared his throat. "I think," he said carefully, "we all want what's best for the community." The captain said nothing, because he understood. He had lost. That night, patrols eased up. Raids stopped. Pressure evaporated. No announcement was made. None was needed. The bodyguard remained at Bumpy's side, not because violence was coming, but because peace had to be protected just as fiercely. And Harlem remembered the lesson. One shot had been fired, but it was restraint that made it legendary. Justice in Harlem didn't arrive wearing a badge. It arrived quietly, in the days that followed, when things stopped breaking. The raids ended first. Squad cars still rolled through the neighborhood, but slower now, less theatrical. Officers kept their eyes forward instead of scanning faces like targets. The captain who had pushed hardest for force was suddenly reassigned. Nothing official, nothing dramatic. Just a quiet transfer that felt suspiciously like a demotion. No press release explained it. Harlem understood anyway. Bumpy Johnson didn't celebrate. That wasn't his way. He spent the morning after the meeting walking the neighborhood, nodding to shop owners, stopping to talk with an elderly man outside a bakery, listening more than he spoke. People noticed that. They always did. Because Bumpy understood something most powerful men never learned. Respect wasn't demanded. It was demonstrated. The bodyguard followed at his usual distance. Same posture, same watchful eyes. But something had changed. The streets looked at him differently now. He called his inner circle together after midnight. The room was dim, lit by a single bulb swinging slightly from the ceiling. The bodyguard stood near the wall, arms folded, listening. "This stops now," Bumpy said. "Not tomorrow, not after another warning." One man spoke up. "If we move, the police will be watching." Bumpy smiled thinly. "They're always watching." He turned to his bodyguard. "You ready?" The man nodded once. That was all that was ever needed. The meeting happened 2 nights later in an abandoned warehouse near the river, a place chosen for its isolation and its symbolism. Neutral ground, they called it. A lie everyone agreed to because it kept blood off the sidewalks. The cousin arrived first, flanked by men who tried to look brave. Bumpy arrived second, unannounced, walking in like he owned the air itself. The bodyguard stayed just behind him. No weapons were drawn. That made it worse. The cousin spoke first. "You had my blood killed," he said. "Now you want to talk?" Bumpy stopped a few feet away. "I didn't have anyone killed," he replied. "I stopped a mistake from becoming a pattern." The cousin sneered. "You think that justifies it?" Bumpy leaned in slightly. "I think you standing here breathing justifies my patience." That hit harder than a threat. The cousin's men shifted uneasily. They hadn't expected calm. They hadn't expected control. They had expected fear. "You're losing your grip," the cousin said, louder now. "This is a new Harlem." Bumpy's eyes hardened. "There's no such thing as a new Harlem," he said. "Only men who forget why the old ones survived." He turned slightly, addressing everyone in the room. "You beat my runner. You defaced businesses that feed families. You brought chaos where there was order." His gaze returned to the cousin. "And you think I'm the problem?" The cousin reached into his coat. That was the last mistake. The bodyguard moved before the thought could finish forming. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. One shot, history repeating itself. The cousin fell, clutching his chest, eyes wide with disbelief. No one else moved. Bumpy looked down at the body, then at the men frozen in fear. "This is over," he said. "Anyone who wants to keep breathing will understand that." No one argued. No one reached for a weapon. They knew. They all knew. By morning, the police were scrambling. 2 shootings, one legend at the center of both. Pressure mounted from City Hall, from the press, from precincts embarrassed by their lack of control. But Harlem was calm, too calm, and that calm told a story no report could erase. By the 3rd morning, Harlem had chosen its side. No speeches were given, no announcements made, but the signs were everywhere. Storefronts reopened without fear. Numbers runners returned to their roots. Jazz clubs filled again, music pouring into the streets like nothing had happened. That was the loudest message of all. Order had been restored, and that terrified the people who weren't supposed to lose control. At police headquarters, the captain who had stood in Bumpy Johnson's living room was now standing in front of men who wore better suits and asked sharper questions. 2 dead bodies, one common thread, and a community that refused to cooperate. "Why hasn't Johnson been picked up?" one official demanded. The captain hesitated. Because we don't have him, he admitted, and if we grab him without leverage, Harlem will light up. That answer didn't sit well. Orders came down fast and heavy. Bring him in. Not quietly, publicly. They found Bumpy Johnson exactly where they expected to, walking out of a barber shop on Lenox Avenue just after noon. Sun high, street busy, witnesses everywhere. Squad cars screeched to a halt, officers poured out, hands on weapons, voices sharp and rehearsed. "Bumpy Johnson," the captain shouted. "Hands where we can see them." The street froze. Bumpy stopped walking. He raised his hands slowly, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. The bodyguard stepped half a pace forward, then stopped when Bumpy lifted a finger slightly. It was handled. The captain marched up, cuffs ready. "You're coming with us," he said, "for questioning." Bumpy looked around at the faces watching from sidewalks, windows, doorways. He saw fear, he saw anger, but most of all, he saw expectation. He turned back to the captain. "Am I under arrest?" Bumpy asked. "For now." "For what?" The captain leaned in. "For thinking you run this place." Bumpy smiled. The cuffs clicked shut. The precinct was loud on purpose. Phones rang non-stop. Officers walked too close. Desks scraped chairs. It was intimidation by atmosphere, meant to remind men like Bumpy Johnson that walls and badges were supposed to matter. The room went quiet. Bumpy adjusted his jacket and turned to his bodyguard. "Time to remind them," he said. But before any move could be made, the police arrived. Not quietly. 4 cars, 8 officers. A captain who had built his career on making examples out of men who looked like Bumpy Johnson. He stepped inside without knocking, eyes scanning the room like he already owned it. "We're looking for a shooter," the captain said. "Figured we'd start here." Bumpy met his gaze evenly. "You're in my house," Bumpy replied. "If you're looking for something, you should learn some manners." The captain smirked. "Careful," he said. "You're not untouchable." Bumpy leaned forward slightly. "Neither are you." That was the moment. The room tightened, the air thickened. Everyone understood the stakes had just doubled, because this wasn't just street business anymore. This was authority versus influence, and both sides were about to find out who really controlled Harlem when the law decided to push too hard, and the legend decided he wouldn't bend. The captain took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You think one dead punk scares me?" he said. "I can shut you down with paperwork and prisons." Bumpy smiled, but his eyes were cold. "Then why are you standing in my living room instead of doing it?" Silence answered him. And in that silence, the bodyguard shifted his weight, just enough for everyone to notice. No gun drawn, no threat spoken, just presence. The kind that reminded men how fragile power really was. The police captain didn't like silence. Silence meant uncertainty, and uncertainty was something he had spent his entire career trying to crush. He cleared his throat, straightened his coat, and looked around the room as if daring someone to blink. "You think this is some kind of standoff?" he said. "I can have this place turned upside down by nightfall." Bumpy Johnson didn't move. He sat back in his chair, fingers folded loosely, his posture relaxed in a way that made men nervous. He had learned long ago that composure unsettled bullies more than shouting ever could. "You could," Bumpy said calmly, "but you won't." The captain's jaw tightened. "And why's that?" "Because," Bumpy replied, "you don't bring 4 cars and a speech unless you're hoping I'll give you something you can't get on your own." The captain glanced briefly at the bodyguard, then back at Bumpy. "You protecting killers now?" Bumpy tilted his head. "I protect Harlem," he said. "Sometimes that means people get hurt. Sometimes it means people stop hurting others." The captain scoffed. "That your justification?" "That's my reality." The room held its breath. This wasn't just about the shooting anymore. It was about jurisdiction. Who truly governed Harlem when the law arrived late and left early? The police could flood the streets, but they couldn't replace the order that men like Bumpy enforced every day, quietly, relentlessly. The captain knew it. That knowledge made him dangerous. He stepped closer, invading Bumpy's space. "You keep playing king," he said, lowering his voice, "and I'll make sure you die like everyone else." That was when the bodyguard spoke for the first time. "Step back." 2 words, flat, unemotional. The captain turned sharply. "You talking to me?" The bodyguard met his eyes. "I said step back." For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the younger officers shifted nervously, his hand brushing his holster. He knew what this felt like, the second before something went wrong. The captain laughed, forcing bravado. "You hear this?" he said to his men. "I'm being threatened in broad daylight." Bumpy raised a hand slightly. "That's enough," he said, not loudly, but firmly. The bodyguard fell silent. Bumpy looked at the captain with something approaching pity. "You came here to remind me who you think is in charge," Bumpy said, "but the truth is, you don't have the appetite for what comes next." The captain stared at him, trying to decide whether that was a bluff. It wasn't, and that frightened him more than anger ever could. Without another word, the captain turned and walked out. The officers followed, their boots loud against the wooden floor. When the door finally closed, the room exhaled. The lieutenant shook his head. "He's going to make trouble," he said. Bumpy nodded. "Of course he is," Bumpy replied. "Men like him always do when they realize they don't matter as much as they thought." That night, Harlem felt different. Too quiet in some places, too loud in others. The rival crew didn't retreat, they escalated. A storefront tied to Bumpy's operation was vandalized. A runner went missing. Rumors spread that the cousin was gathering men, planning something big, something final. Bumpy knew where this road ended. That laugh was the second mistake. The third was reaching inside his jacket, not fast enough to fire, but fast enough to justify what came next. The bodyguard didn't wait for orders. He fired once. The man fell backward like his strings had been cut. Blood darkened the pavement as screams broke the spell. The other 2 men ran, one stumbling, the other already knowing they'd just witnessed something they'd never escape. Bumpy Johnson stood there, unmoved. He looked down at the body, then at his bodyguard. "Let's go," Bumpy said quietly. They walked away before the sirens arrived. And by morning, Harlem knew. 1 shot, 1 message. Disrespect had a price, and the streets would never forget who had collected it. By sunrise, the story had already grown teeth. It moved the way real stories in Harlem always did, through barbershops before breakfast, through church basements before noon, whispered between numbers runners and cab drivers who never forgot a face. By the time the police taped off the sidewalk outside the jazz club, everyone already knew the truth. Bumpy Johnson's bodyguard had fired the shot, and that meant the rules were still the rules. For years, Harlem had existed in a delicate balance, street order maintained not by the law, but by men who understood consequence. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just another operator in that ecosystem, he was the stabilizer. The man who absorbed chaos before it spilled into the streets and hurt the people who lived there. That was why shopkeepers paid their dues without resentment, why musicians could play late into the night without fear, why mothers let their sons walk to the corner store after dark. Bumpy didn't promise safety. He enforced predictability, and predictability in Harlem was priceless. But outside forces never respected that distinction. The city saw Harlem as a problem to manage. The newspapers saw it as a spectacle, and the police, especially the ones assigned uptown, saw it as a place where force came before fairness. The shooting gave them the excuse they'd been waiting for. By noon, police captains were demanding answers. Detectives were leaning on informants who suddenly found their throats dry and their memories unreliable. Squad cars crawled through Bumpy's territory slower than usual, officers staring just a little too long at anyone who met their gaze. They weren't hunting the shooter. They were testing the temperature, and Bumpy Johnson felt it immediately. That afternoon, he sat in the back room of a modest brownstone, sunlight filtering through lace curtains yellowed by time and smoke. The bodyguard stood near the door, silent as ever, his presence both shield and warning. Bumpy listened as his lieutenant laid out the situation. "They're nervous," the man said. "Police, rivals, everybody. Some folks think this was too loud." Bumpy smiled faintly. "Loud doesn't mean reckless," he said. "It means heard." He tapped ash into a tray and looked up. "Anybody say my name yet?" "Not officially," the lieutenant replied, "but they're circling." Bumpy nodded. "Let them." That was the thing about Bumpy Johnson that unnerved his enemies. He didn't flinch at attention. He understood that visibility, when controlled, was leverage. And right now, Harlem needed to be reminded of who set the terms. But not everyone learned the same lessons. Across town, in a smoky back room filled with men who mistook ambition for wisdom, the surviving members of the rival crew argued about what came next. One man wanted revenge. Another wanted to disappear. The leader, the one who had laughed, was dead, but his cousin wasn't. And grief, mixed with humiliation, made men dangerous. "He thinks he can just walk away," the cousin snarled. "One of ours gets dropped and that's it?" An older man at the table shook his head slowly. "That wasn't just one of ours," he said. "That was a message. You don't answer messages with noise. You answer them with survival." The cousin slammed his fist on the table. "Then Harlem's gonna see we don't scare easy." Those words sealed more than he realized. Because while the streets might tolerate ambition, they did not tolerate destabilization. And once a man made it clear he was willing to burn the neighborhood just to soothe his pride, he stopped being a player. He became a problem. 3 days later, the pressure escalated. A numbers runner under Bumpy's protection was beaten within an inch of his life and left in an alley as a warning. Not robbed, not silenced, marked. That was a direct violation of the code. When the runner was carried into the brownstone, Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He didn't pace. He listened. Then he stood. "Who did it?" he asked. Names were given. Addresses confirmed. The shot echoed down 125th Street like a thunderclap ripped straight out of Judgment Day. One gunshot. Clean. Final. For half a second, Harlem froze. Men who had lived their entire lives under the sound of sirens, arguments, and back-alley violence stood motionless. Not because they hadn't heard gunfire before, but because they knew who that shot belonged to, and more importantly, who it had been fired for. The man holding the smoking revolver didn't run. He didn't shout. He didn't celebrate. He simply lowered the gun, adjusted his coat, and looked down at the body bleeding onto the pavement. That man was Bumpy Johnson's bodyguard, and with that single pull of the trigger, the balance of power in Harlem shifted forever. Police whistles pierced the air seconds later, but no one moved. Not the shop owners peering nervously through cracked doors, not the street hustlers pressed against brick walls, not even the rival crew standing across the street, suddenly aware they had crossed a line they didn't understand until it was far too late. Because in Harlem, there were shootings, and then there were messages. This one had just been delivered. To understand why that single shot changed Harlem, you had to understand the man it protected. And to understand him, you had to understand the world that made him necessary. Years earlier, long before the echo of that gunshot carved itself into Harlem folklore, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson walked those same streets with a reputation that preceded him like a shadow. Harlem in the 1930s and 40s wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a battleground. It was a place where black residents were boxed in by poverty, policed by contempt, and exploited by outsiders who thought fear was enough to keep order. White mobsters ran numbers operations and rackets, while local communities paid the price in silence. Law enforcement didn't protect Harlem, it contained it. And into that pressure cooker stepped Bumpy Johnson. Tall, sharp-eyed, impeccably dressed, Bumpy didn't rule with chaos, he ruled with calculation. He read philosophy as easily as he read people. He quoted Shakespeare and Bible verses in the same breath he negotiated street business. And most importantly, he understood power. Bumpy didn't see Harlem as territory to exploit, he saw it as something to defend. That distinction mattered, because while others chased profit alone, Bumpy chased leverage. respect, control that came not from brute force, but from consequence. If Bumpy Johnson said a man was protected, that man was safe. If he said a line had been crossed, there would be a reckoning. And Bumpy never made threats he couldn't finish, which is why he never moved alone. At his side, almost always just a step behind, was his bodyguard, a quiet man with hard eyes and a discipline sharpened by years of survival. He wasn't famous. His name didn't make headlines. That was by design. He was there to make sure Bumpy Johnson lived long enough to remain Bumpy Johnson. The streets knew him as the line between argument and obituary. And on the night that shot was fired, that line had been tested. The tension had been building for weeks. A rival crew, new blood, reckless, hungry, had been pushing into territory that didn't belong to them. They ignored warnings, dismissed intermediaries, mocked the old rules that kept Harlem from tearing itself apart. They thought Bumpy was slipping. They thought age and notoriety had softened him. Worst of all, they thought disrespect was free. It started small, a hijacked delivery here, a numbers runner beaten there. Then came the whispers, Bumpy's losing control. Bumpy's men don't scare anyone anymore. Those whispers reached the wrong ears. One night, outside a jazz club glowing with trumpet smoke and neon promise, the disrespect went public. Bumpy Johnson stepped out onto the sidewalk, coat pressed, hat tilted just right. Music spilled out behind him, laughter following close. His bodyguard scanned the street the way he always did, slow, deliberate, professional. That's when they stepped forward. 3 men, too loud, too confident. One of them smiled like he wanted to be remembered. "Harlem's changing, old man," the leader said, his voice cutting through the night. "You don't own these streets anymore." The sidewalk went quiet. Bumpy stopped walking. He didn't turn right away. That pause, that silence, was a warning to anyone who understood him. Finally, Bumpy looked at the man, really looked at him, and when he spoke, his voice wasn't angry, it was disappointed. "Son," he said calmly, "you confuse noise for strength and youth for immunity." The man laughed. The story did that for him. When young men talked about power, older ones corrected them. "Power isn't how loud you are," they'd say. "Power is when one move fixes everything." That was the lesson Harlem carried forward. Because the shot hadn't sparked a war, it had ended one before it started. As Bumpy aged, his influence shifted from enforcement to example. He spoke less, listened more, let others step forward under the rules he had already carved into stone. When he finally left the streets for good, Harlem didn't collapse. That was his final victory. The system he built outlived him. And whenever the balance threatened to tip, whenever someone mistook aggression for authority, the old story resurfaced. Not as a warning, as a memory. A reminder that there was a time when one man's bodyguard fired one shot, and Harlem chose order over chaos. That's how legends endure, not through monuments, but through behavior, through what people don't do, because they remember what happened the last time someone forgot. This wasn't just a story about a gunshot on a Harlem sidewalk. It was a story about restraint in a world that rewarded recklessness, about a community that learned, over decades of betrayal, that order didn't always come from institutions built to ignore them. When Bumpy Johnson's bodyguard fired that one shot, it wasn't about vengeance, it wasn't about ego, and it wasn't about dominance. It was about drawing a line so clear that no one dared erase it. Harlem had seen violence before, too much of it. What made this moment legendary wasn't the act itself, it was what followed. No war, no chaos, no spiral of retaliation, just a return to balance. That's the part history often leaves out. Because real power doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't need to. Real power acts once, decisively, and lets the consequences speak forever. Bumpy Johnson understood that. So did the man who stood at his side, silent until silence was no longer enough. This wasn't about one man's pride. It was about a neighborhood's dignity, about teaching a lesson without burning the village down to do it. And that's why, decades later, Harlem still remembers. Not the sound of the shot, but the silence that came after. Because in that silence, a message was delivered more clearly than any speech, badge, or courtroom ruling ever could. Respect isn't demanded. Order isn't imposed. And sometimes it takes a legend and one perfectly chosen moment to remind the world of the difference.